All right, so hi everybody. We've got Congress hopeful Liam O'Mara with us. I have prefaced with a little bit of introduction. Uh, you're running for the 42nd District out of California. Um, and one of the things that I was talking about, which I found so appealing about you as a candidate, is kind of your background and your approach to this campaign of issuing the PAC money and running a real grassroots talk to constituents, actually represent people like a representative. I know.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a revolutionary concept there, isn't it?
yes. Um, so I wanted to give the floor to you to kind of give a bit of a background on yourself and your journey um, to where you are today, running for office, and through who you are as a person first. 'Cause I think a
Sure.
lot of
Okay.
that's very relevant.
Yeah. Start with the person. Like, who is this guy?
Exactly.
It's-
Oh, hold on a moment. Hold on. Let me turn your volume up. They're saying your voice is kind of low. Uh,
Ow.
yeah. Hopefully that's better.
Does this sound better? Blah
Uh,
blah blah. Words, words.
that better, folks? Okay. You're good.
Okay.
Much better.
All right. So let's see. I am the first in my family to go to college, and didn't really expect to. I'm from an entirely working class family, and in fact, I was so convinced that there was no possibility of it that I didn't even bother taking the SATs at high
Hmm.
school. I didn't manage to get into college until I was 30. And that's sort of a long story as to how that happened there. But yeah, just wasn't really going to be in the cards. And I jumped on the chance when I had it. But I come from a working class union family. My father just retired after 50 years in the Port of LA in Long Beach.
Okay.
And I actually had gotten into that briefly as a fourth generation longshoreman. My great grandfather was in the first generation to retire from down there.
Hmm.
But by that point, I mean, automation had taken so much of it away. The union was getting weaker and weaker, and it's just been harder and harder for the last few decades for people to really to stay afloat on basic working incomes, which is really one of the problems driving me into this. I'll come back to that in a moment.
Right.
But yeah, I managed to dive in at age 30, went to college, and went straight through from BA, MA, PhD. And I've been teaching for the last dozen years. And that really has been amazing for me. It's kind of like it was always the ideal career. I mean, I'm a nerd. There's no way around that.
Right.
I mean,
And your PhD again is in history. Is it a specific area of history?
yeah, it's I'm technically what's called a historian of ideas or an
Historian.
intellectual historian. So
Okay.
I study like big systems of thought and change over time there, as opposed to a specific time or place.
Hmm.
But my regional specializations are the Middle East and Europe.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I study like economics, politics, religion, philosophy. Big ideas as opposed to a single location.
Right. Right.
Um, and that was great because it gives me a way to sort of like draw on that background and draw on the fact that I read constantly and have from the age of 2, just been sucking things in. I mean, the joke is always my house is nothing but books and cats. It's pretty accurate. I mean, my mother still teases me for having so little actual furniture. I'm like,
Hmm.
but I have 34 bookcases. Look, that's furniture, right? And it's like, it's more like wallpaper to her. Well, whatever. I do what I can.
Hmm.
But being able to communicate ideas in the classroom really matters to me. But that
Right.
brings me to why I'm running for office, because as a Gen Xer, I was in the first generation in American history not to do better than the parents' generation. And the millennials are considerably worse off than me. And Gen Z is considerably worse off than the millennials. And I have to look my students in the eyes and say, y'all screwed.
Yeah.
Like
And that trend
we messed
is
it up.
getting worse. Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting steadily worse. And instead of dealing with the real problems, all I see is people running on tons of like BS culture war stuff and
Hmm.
scapegoating and just ignoring what's actually causing this. In fact, people are generally lining up to vote for the people who did this in the first place,
Hmm.
who damaged us in the first place. And that really frustrates me. So I figured, well, since my background is in taking complex ideas and making them intelligible to people, since I do that in the classroom, and since I don't have this sort of cloistered ivory tower sort of sensibility anyway, I can try to connect to ordinary people and bring these ideas out and get us talking about them.
I think that's extremely valuable. That's speaking to my heart, especially. Like that's a lot of what we do on this channel is exactly that sort of thing. Is try and analyze what's going on in the world, and especially through the lens of history, because, like the adage is, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And there's a lot of things that the events that we're seeing are paralleling, and none of them lead to good places.
Yeah, no, it's again, yeah, you're exactly right. Those who refuse the lessons of history are condemned to repeat its mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing that again and again. And you're right. Rather than addressing the real issues, what we've seen over the course of the last few decades, I mean, starting in the 1960s, but picking up speed from the 1980s on, is a steady drift in the American right into neo-fascism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And instead of recognizing that, people are in absolute denial about what these words even mean, or like what it is they're talking about. And there's no effective response, certainly not from Democrats. And that also is a lesson of history. I mean, liberals do not put up a good resistance to fascism. They never have.
That's true.
So we have to be willing to like actually turn this around, talk about the same issues, fight fire with fire, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Keld, I do have that lined up to ask him in a little bit. So we've got people already wanting to ping you with questions, but yeah, I'll get to that in just a little bit.
Answer anything.
The one thing that caught my eye was your endorsement list, and what caught my eye about it is you listed not only fairly large endorsements like Andrew Yang and Ted Lieu, but also a whole host of kind of personal endorsements, which are usually overlooked, but in my opinion are in many ways a lot more validating, because these are people who know you, who have been around you. One of them in particular was Robert Sladen's quote, Imam are as a defender of the people in an era where so many Americans are struggling, are finding their dreams denied. This is a champion, someone who will fight for every constituent on every block in every section of the district. And I was a little curious if you could briefly say who Robert Sladen was to you.
He was actually a peer at one of my universities, and was actually a professor when I jumped into college as an adult. I mean, one of the places that I've worked is actually where I had done my BA work. And I jumped from there to a different grad school. And then as soon as I finished my qualifying exams, that university called me back up and say, hey, you want to like come teach here? I'm like, yeah. So, but he like knew me both as a student and then as a colleague.
Very good.
That's somebody that I've spoken to a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of them on there that are pretty personal like that. They're people that they were colleagues, they're former students, they were friends of mine, as well as, major political figures and whatnot there.
Right.
Yeah, I did want to give a range of voices because it gives a better sense of who you are.
Right.
Rather than somebody who's just endorsing you for the politics and maybe has only met you once or twice.
Exactly. Yeah. That kind of fishtales, I know a lot of interviews get just into the issues, but this is kind of fishtailing into a bit of what Keld is asking about, and something that I wanted to ask you about in particular, which first and foremost is a lot of politicians, when they get in, especially into federal office, you see them on TV sometimes, you hear about them in news articles sometimes, but there's a lack of connection to constituents. And I'm curious what sort of mechanisms you'll use, what sort of outreach you'll do to stay in touch with your district, with people in your district, with the opinions, and not only in getting their thoughts on things, but also educating them on things that are coming up in Congress that you'll be voting on and why you'll be voting a certain way, or you know, convincing them that a certain way is worth voting. So.
You're touching on something that's actually extremely important to me. So I actually have to preface it a little bit with like why it's important. Because on the one hand, it's a personal ethical consideration. It just, I mean, public service means a lot to me, and you are serving the public. So you work at you know, at their sufferance. You have an obligation to spend time with them. And it frustrates me that people don't.
Right.
But my incumbent is particularly bad at this.
I've noticed that.
28th year in office. It's been more than 10 years since he's had any kind of town hall. And when he did those before, they were highly scripted events there. Does not answer constituent concerns, does not show up in the media, does not talk to people. What you get is every 2 years, there's a blitz of ad buys and a company that puts signs out. And that's it. He doesn't even campaign, much less actually come out and talk to people.
Well, in a lot of these races, he hasn't needed to campaign.
Yeah, exactly. And he's certainly taking me a bit more seriously than a lot of past candidates here, and mentioning me constantly by name. So I think that we have picked up a lot of steam in the area. If we had even a quarter of the kind of funding that he gets easily, this would be no contest at all. I mean, as it is, I have a ton of people who are self-identified conservatives that are all aboard.
That's excellent.
Because I'm willing to talk. And I tell people, we're not going to agree on every issue, but I'm always going to listen to you, and I'm going to take you seriously. I'm always going to come back. I respond to people on social media. I respond to emails. We did tons of public events where there's sort of like open town halls, and people can come and throw any question at me. And I'm not like weeding these things out, like, you know, like only give me the softballs here. Like, no, like, hit me with anything. And we continued to do that when we had to adapt for COVID. We did a weekly themed town hall thing where we had an issue, brought in some guests, and then opened it up, and we took questions and actually interacted with people. So it gave me an opportunity to push certain issues and engage on different topics, but still continue to engage with people.
Right.
And it's something that I'm going to carry into public office. I am going to always hold open town halls, both the AMA style, where they can hit me with anything, and ones on important issues. I want to introduce this particular bill. I'm going to come out and I'm going to talk to you about it. I'm not just going to appear on TV. I'm going to come out here and I'm going to talk about it.
I think that's really, really important. And it's definitely something that's missing in federal politics, in all levels of it, really. Another
just on a related point, actually, to connect to that, I think one of the reasons it's so easy for me is that I see a connection between what I do in a classroom and what I do in politics. And I used to see politicians as basically thought leaders in the country. Their job was to come out there and talk about important issues, and to sway people to them, to like say, hey, this is a good idea, this is why, and actually, oh, okay, that's a good idea. And it just seems in more recent decades that most of our politicians have become followers instead of leaders. They wait for opinion polls to tell them that this is a safe position to take, and they're not willing to talk about it until the opinion polls match.
Right.
And to me, that's just BS. It's an abdication of responsibility. We have to be willing to talk about these issues.
I 100% agree. And yeah, you definitely hit on with the avoiding of any sort of controversial topic. Is what that has led to is every topic being considered controversial. And you see things like, is the coronavirus real, politicized for some reason?
Right.
And a lot of that is, I think, rooted in exactly what you're touching on, which is that our leaders are not leading, are not taking that role seriously of educating.
Driven media is doing it, and it's like the sensationalization, and people can run whatever they want, and then the politicians just shamelessly follow along with that, and it makes no sense to me. I far prefer people who are willing to stand up on principle and make an unpopular issue popular. Bernie did that with Medicare.
Yes.
Yang did that with the UBI. They took a position that was not mainstream, and they made it one by talking about it in a convincing way. I
Yes.
think that's what we need in our politics.
And there are some issues where it is just, this is, the facts support it. And if someone's willing to go to bat for it, that's where it'll land.
Hmm.
Now, that does get to some of the issues, and I do want to ask you about these, but obviously, your website, you have a lot of very well thought out things, positions on pretty much every range of subject. Most running for office do, but I want to needle you on one thing in particular, which is when you get into office, there's kind of two jobs of Congress people, of representatives. One is to vote on legislation, one is to write legislation. And I'm curious, obviously, you can't hit the ground running writing legislation for everything. So, what would you consider like your main pet issues that you would want to hit the ground running, get a team of experts together, and start just forging ahead on developing some legislation around?
Yeah, I'll give you two quick answers to that. One is sort of like the cheesy answer, and that is I do plan to walk in with a ton of things already ready to go, because this is just me coming at this. I am a policy wonk by nature.
Okay.
So I'm not afraid to get into the weeds on this and to talk details. And yeah, I mean, I didn't have to. I mean, honestly, the issues on there. I mean, so many of those things need to be like rewritten or have like a shorter version of them that hits basically the kind of points that come up in our conversations. Because I wrote those 2 years ago, just
Hmm.
coming into this, but I had already thought through a ton of issues before I got into this, rather than having to follow along with something.
Right.
But there are things that are more important than not. And some of them are things that we already have some discussion on, so I intend to contribute profitably on them. We can talk, for example, there's a number of things that people get wrong on the Medicare for All proposals. And I'm going to walk in there and say, no, this has to be done this way, right?
Okay.
Or improvements can be made to like the G&D framework that could make it work better and help to actually get some traction with it. Others would be things that I'd be willing to push directly on my own, and find co-sponsors for right away. I mean, some of them are basic economic issues. We're still going to be dealing with this pandemic.
Yes.
So I come into office in January. I'm going to be walking there talking about basic income, and the need to actually support people here, and setting in place a framework to prevent the kind of mistakes that I saw this time around. One of the things that so frustrated me was that we allowed so many people to lose jobs in the first place. Other
Right.
rich countries used wage subsidies
Yeah.
and basically paid people to go part-time or to stay at home, period.
Yep.
And that helped to flatten those curves without creating the long-term problem of unemployment to people having to find jobs again.
Right.
We've turned this pandemic into a massive recession, and the most unequal one in the modern period, that has seen millions of people lose jobs that are not going to come back at all.
Hmm.
By the
And
time the situation is recovered overall economically, a lot of those jobs are just going to be automated away anyway.
yeah.
So we created a massive long-term problem that was not necessary. So I'd like to see legislation in place that says, in the event of a national emergency like this, we kick in wage subsidies and we prevent large-scale unemployment. I mean, the goal of economic policy should be to ensure full employment at a living wage. Whatever accomplishes that makes sense to do.
Right.
And trying to like walk away from that and abdicate that responsibility to actually help to safeguard the real economy. And by real economy, I mean the money circulating in our hands.
Hmm.
You give a poor person money, they spend it, that stimulates the real economy, that sort of thing. We've just walked away from that. We don't pay attention to it. I want to start introducing bills that directly address that and prevent future disasters and take care of current ones. So current ones address basic income and address things like paid family leave, child care. Start cutting. I mean, I know people that pay $12,000 to $15,000 a year for child care. How the hell is that sustainable? I mean, when we've got wages that have been stagnant for 40 years, the
Hmm.
cost of healthcare goes up, cost of housing goes up, cost of childcare goes up, but wages stay flat. We fall farther and farther in debt. And I
Yep.
mean, we have to start fixing this instead of just throwing little Band-Aids every now and then.
Yeah, I fully agree. And yeah, and meanwhile, one of the things that we were talking about was an article that came out in the Guardian, which mentioned that our billionaires have added 26% to their wealth, bringing them up to like $10.2 trillion over the last several months.
Yep.
Meanwhile, 30 to 40 million people are facing eviction.
Right. Yeah, and that actually, it's completely understandable and easily predictable because it's been the pattern for decades. I mean, the top 1% and a little larger, the top 10% even, have gained massively in the last few decades. Meanwhile, in the last 20 years, the bottom 50% of the country have lost $1 trillion in wealth. We've declined in our assets. Most American families never fully recovered from the 2008 recession, if at all. And here we're hitting them with another one. It just, nothing gets better. We just keep bumping our way down. And we have to start addressing an economy that works for everyone, not just one that works for the top. And we're not going to get that from the media, and we're not going to get that from bought and paid for politicians either, because you're going to get the same basic narrative. The stock market's great, unemployment is low, ergo good economy. And that's all they're going to care about. In this recovery, they already have a good stock market. All they're going to care about is getting jobs back. And it doesn't matter if they're terrible jobs. It doesn't matter if you don't make a good, a third of the population makes a living wage in the Inland Empire. We have really stubborn poverty rates in large parts of this area, and we're leaving them behind. And that is dragging the entire country down. We have to stop thinking about Wall Street and start thinking about Main Street.
Yes, fully agreed. Which does bring up a related question of how do you make the pitch? How do you make it palatable to moderates or conservatives to have something like a progressive tax, say, to start, making some more substantial policy moves in a
honestly,
progressive direction?
It would be so much easier to do this if more people were doing something similar. Frankly, a lot of Democratic messaging is just terrible.
It is.
We don't frame arguments very well, and we're constantly losing ground to the right as a consequence. What you need to do is basically look at how people are going to look at it themselves, right? Get back to thinking in terms of like kitchen table economics instead of big abstractions. So when I talk about things like Medicare for all, for example, I talk about it as a tax cut.
Okay.
Because it would be effectively a tax cut and a massive rise in salaries because of the way the savings work out for it.
Yes.
But the tax, of course, is going to these parasitic private middlemen, the insurance companies,
Yes.
right? But that is effectively a tax because I am still paying out of pocket for something, or it's coming out of my compensation package, money that could be my salary.
Right.
And if you tell somebody in these conservative areas that I'm going to make your salary go up by $10,000, you want to keep 10,000 more of your own dollars, of your own money, I'm your guy. Because that's their issue with taxes. It's not the abstraction of taxes. The right was brilliant to do this. What they've done is managed to tie, they want tax cuts for the super rich. That's all they really care about.
Right.
But they tie it to people's basic, their home finances. I take an X amount of money, X amount is lost, and I have this left over to pay my bills. I need more money to pay my bills. If we were out there saying, I want you to make more and keep more of your own money, we'd win more races. So I'm telling people, I want to lower your taxes. And I'll point out, like the Ken Calvert keeps talking about, I cut your taxes, but he didn't.
Right.
I mean, that the Tax Cut and Jobs, whatever act that Trump got through here, raised taxes for most people in California because it took away our state tax deduction from the federal taxes. And we lost a ton of other exemptions that are all going to disappear after a short period. So it's going to lead to a significant increase in taxes on the middle and working classes here.
Yeah, it's just smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of like, you just show them, I want our taxes to go back to, where they were between like, say, if you want to go back as far as like Eisenhower or maybe into the Johnson era, right?
Okay.
I want to take our taxes down and push the taxes on the rich back up.
Right.
And the key there is to show them that they're connected too. And that's another thing that I think a lot of Democrats fail massively on because they think of it in terms of justice. The wealthy need to pay their fair share. Honestly, a lot of conservatives don't give a damn about fair shares because they're thinking, I guess in Steinbeck's term, as I'm a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. I want to be him someday, so I don't want to like have him taxed because I relate to him. I think about
Right.
I'm having to pay more. So it doesn't work. It's the wrong kind of logic, the wrong kind of framing. What you do is you show them that it's a matter of setting incentives right. The taxes on the rich are not taxes to pay for government programs. It's not because the federal government needs the money. The taxes are set high because it shifts their spending incentives in the economy. If I lower the taxes on the super rich, a company is going to give me a massive compensation package because I get to keep it. And then I'm just taking that money out of the economy. If the taxes are high, if there's a high marginal tax rate, why would they give me a $50 million compensation package? It would be pointless because it would just get taxed away. So they're going to give me $2 million. I mean, we made plenty of millionaires in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like, it's still going to be a high pay, but it's going to take us back to the same basic thing you see around the world, where the difference between like average workers and CEOs is like 20 to 40 times, rather than the 300 and 400 times it is in the U.S. That's all tax policy. But the way it relates to ordinary people is it lowers our wages.
Right.
Lower taxes for them means that my wages are stagnant. Mine will not go up because it discourages investment in the real economy. It means they're not going to expand their business. They're not going to give raises to their workers. We used to give tax incentives for giving raises to ordinary people. Now we give a tax incentive for people to put money in the Cayman Islands. So it's just
the incentives are wrong.
Crazy economics. It's like, it's just wrong. It's flat out wrong, and it has a seriously negative impact on people here.
Right.
Our wages have been flat for 40 years because of low taxes on the rich.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. There's a pair of related questions from chat, so I'm going to merge them together. One is, someone says, I argue that very little gets done in Washington without some corporate support. And this is, we're talking about taxes, so this does dovetail into that. How do you push an agenda that doesn't directly support corporate interests? And related, how do you keep your identity and your message when your party is saying to vote along a party line, or they'll make campaigning difficult? Now, I think I know your answer to the latter one, but take it.
Yeah, you're right. They are kind of related. Okay, so let's deal with the latter one first.
Okay.
The trick there is to win. If you win, they know you're in their coalition. You're on their side, even if they disagree with you on a lot of issues, and they can count on you at least voting along similar lines to them on a lot of other issues. So you don't get as much pushback as people think. There will be some, but I mean, your Ilhan Omars and your AOCs are kind of showing that you can push back against leadership. They will push back a bit too, but there is a dialogue, and they're stuck with you. I mean, what you have to do is you have to force them to put up with you. And, that gets into the corporations too, because they'll fund like primary challengers and try to get somebody who's a bit more pliant there.
Right.
But once you're in, you have the bully pulpit, you have the megaphone. You have an opportunity to really reach out to people and to hold on to your coalition and make it larger. We saw that with people like, again, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. I mean, their actual numbers went up.
Yeah, they dominated their re-election.
Had the time to actually represent their district and talk to people, and had the resources behind it to amplify their message. So they kept their seats. That's how we win it. We have to get people in the first place. As far as the corporate interest, they're not going to be happy with me, right? Because they're used to basically running things. And honestly, what we have in the U.S. today, I mean, to sort of like borrow or paraphrase from Voland's term here, I mean, we have essentially like an inverted totalitarianism where we put corporations in charge of the state.
Right.
And it has the same basic effect for ordinary people. It's taken away a lot of our agency and turned it over to elites, but instead of it being like the state is essentially captured by these powerful interests. That is going to stay the same until you put in 200 squad members. We're doubling the squad this cycle around, so there's a good reason to hope, right? We're going to have quite a few more there. That number needs to keep going up. The higher that goes up, a lot of people get into politics for the right reasons, I got to say. I mean, there's plenty of people in there that I'll say are just, crooked as a $3 bill. They're just wrong. They're doing all the wrong things. But they got in for the right reasons, but were corrupted by the system.
Right.
Like the circumstances are wrong. What we can do is if we get in enough people, we'll reach a tipping point where a lot of the people in there will will feel emboldened, and they'll find the courage to push back against those benefactors, and we can pass legislation that outright bans lobbying. If we force the money out and we create publicly financed elections, that is how we solve everything else. And realistically, I know it's not as sexy as like talking about Medicare or the Green New Deal, but it's going to be very difficult to get literally anything done for the American worker or the American middle class until we get the big money out, because they're calling all the shots.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is getting the democracy back to democracy.
Yeah, go figure. Actually representing people instead of dollar signs, and that's what we're doing now. We've been effectively an oligarchy for decades, right? But we have at least the formal trappings of a republic still. We have the formal processes of a republic, but it's hard to compete without the money. But it's possible to do. And this is where I think on the left and the more like populist progressive sides of our politics, we have to get past a sense of learned helplessness and be willing to step up for a while. I mean, we think about it as an investment. I've been doing this for years. I donate to house races all across the country, and I don't make a lot of money. I'm not a well-off person, but if you can spare $5 or $10 a month, do it. And I pick out good races each time, and I throw some money into them, because the more people like that we get in, the better. I mean, a common argument I'll make is like, okay, so price of coffee a month, right? It's like $5, and it's tempting to think, well, I can't write a $10,000 check, but I could afford $5. But who cares? It's $5. It's like a hamburger or something. Oh, it's not like it's not going to help the campaign. It does. It does, because if you convince a few thousand people to send $5 a month as a recurring donation to progressive candidates, you can win almost any House race in the country. That's all it would take. So for each of these races, we pick them out, get a few thousand people to each one, set up a $5 recurring donation, and you've got the war chest you need to knock these people out. And we can flip these purple and red districts, the ones that are close there, and we can, get rid of some of the establishment candidates there. And again, you flip that balance of power once you reach a tipping point.
Right.
And at that point, we don't need to. It's not like it's permanent. Like I have to give $5 a month to a bunch of candidates for the rest of my life. I have to do it only until we reach the tipping point and we pass public financing of our elections.
Do you have a mechanism or a organization in mind to plug that handles that kind of thing, that allows for that kind of donation, or is everyone kind of running their own?
Finding the right candidates and whatnot, yeah, we don't really have much in the way of infrastructure for this. A lot of it is still kind of like the Wild West. And a lot of the different organizations are still competing with each other. Right. Some of them are decent ones, like Justice Dems does good work, but they focus a lot on primary challengers. I'm actually involved with a few other candidates that made it as progressives to the general. And what we're going to be doing at the beginning of the year is putting together our own organization and PAC to try and help progressives in general elections. So when people make it through their primaries, then we can shift resources there. But we do need as well, at least on the media side, an ability to kind of pick out these good races, the places where, they'll look at my district and say, there's no way. You just can't do it. It's solidly red. It's only solidly red in its voting history. It's 40% Hispanic, large working class population, only 60% turnout in elections. This district is purple demographically. It could be flipped, but no one's going to spend, none of the big organizations are going to dump cash here.
Right, because they just look at the history.
Yeah, exactly. Look at the history. No way. There are races like that all across this country where we could be competitive and we can make a real difference. And I want to try and shine more of a light on those seats and get people involved, because again, if we can get past this learned helplessness and realize that a few of these small donations a month really add up. And if we can convince our friends, don't just share posts on Twitter. I mean, it's cool, but it's not enough. Right. Find those races and help out. And those investments are how we get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, if you bring up a good point. If the problem, and everyone's upset, is corporate money in politics and controlling politics, we do have to be able to pony up to, or be willing to, invest in combating that. Because if we want a non-corporate owned politician, we have to champion it.
They don't win on charm, and
right.
It's not enough. Phone bankers still cost money. Text banking still costs money. Everything does. Realistically, we can win these races with a lot less than the incumbents will raise, but you do have to pass a certain threshold, and that does require a lot of that small dollar fundraising.
I have another. This is kind of a complex question. um, Congress itself is largely viewed as, at this point, kind of a dysfunctional breaking down machine. It has, as a institution, some of the worst polling in its history, and we're seeing all the areas, especially highlighted by Republicans, in ways that, because there are no legal boundaries around certain things, the flow of things is just being kind of abused. Is that something that can be solved legislatively? And do you have ideas for how to kind of make it function, even if there are bad actors who get into office?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Okay, so there's one. Well, honestly, the bigger solution is not legislative, but it is related to some legislative issues. And the biggest one, the single biggest one, is the cash. As long as you've got unlimited corporate cash coming in, the incentives are there for terrible people to get in. Mm-hmm. Honestly, I tend to push back against a lot of people who push the term limits as a solution to the corruption in Congress, because as far as I'm concerned, it's solving the wrong problem.
I agree.
Term limits would get rid of good people like Markey, but would not deter deeply corrupt people from coming in, because it's the money that does it.
Right.
If we get rid of the money, then the people who stick out are going to be the ones who are genuinely driven by a desire to do public good. And I don't care if you want to stick around for 2 years or 10 years. If that's your motivation, more power to you. We need to actually represent people, and you lose some of that expertise too. Mm-hmm. It's the money that's ultimately corrupting there. And that would help a lot. Changes in the media and fixing some of the problems there, like restoring the fairness doctrine and breaking up some of these massive monopolies, would help a lot too. Because a corporate-driven media feeds into the tribalisms and the BS culture wars that the parties thrive on. They get to talk to a very small base, and they get to ignore most people. And they count on outrage over the issues of the day, distracting from the real pressing problems that they can keep kicking down the field and ignoring year after year after year. Like, I don't know, I mean, we were talking about Medicare for all and a basic income in the 1960s.
Right.
Before I was born. And we're still just barely getting conversations on this. I mean, that's really frustrating. But we're not going to get that with their ability to focus on outrage, on like social and cultural issues, and distract. And as long as 90% of our media intake comes from 5 multinational corporations, they've got no interest in talking about the deeper issues because they benefit from the status quo. So we have to somehow get around that. And I think a lot of that, just like us stumping up to get our 200 squad members in, a lot of the onus is really on us in tuning out from a lot of the fake outrage. It's one thing to see that in Congress, at least, there is an attempt often for people to talk across the aisle, to establish like personal relations and to talk through issues and find their compromises. And that can be good and bad.
Right.
But the bigger issue, the thing that's much, much more important, right, is us talking. Is us stepping outside of our bubbles, us stepping outside of our safe areas and talking to someone who hates us.
Right.
And if we're willing to engage and talk, we start to break down some of those personal barriers that the media is preying on and that the parties are preying on. If we become less tribal and more united, and realistically, we have a lot more in common than not. As much as people might disagree on basic issues, on values, on economics and everything else here, we all want a better life for our kids.
Sure.
We all want to live to see the next day. I mean, we have similar interests. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of cutting through the noise and relating to each other. And I think that if we do more of that, then we can push back against the big institutional forces that are trying to divide us. I can make a parallel really there to something I talk about a lot in history classes, international politics, the whole like imperial divide and rule strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, the British and French are both masters at this. I mean, we look at tons of like really deeply entrenched cultural and sectarian wars around the world here. Whether you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, they were created by the imperial powers deliberately because it made it easier to rule those areas. I mean, the French divided up the populations in Syria who had been neighbors for centuries. And, oh, yeah, my neighbor's Orthodox Christian, this neighbor's Druze, this neighbor's Sunni. I don't care. And they started telling you, no, you should care. That's your identity. Like, those people are different from you. And like, and that has created a significant modern problem that was not there before.
Right.
The same basic technique is used all around the world in our politics. Corporate America and our established elites are dividing us in order to maintain the status quo. So the best solution is for us to toss that and start talking again.
Yeah, that again is preaching to something that I is very close to my heart, and my chat is very familiar with this. One of the things that I try and push is, even just in your own personal life, with your family, with your friends, being able to have conversations again and not just say, we can't talk about politics because it's too controversial. No, just being able to communicate, because you're right, everyone has ultimately the same kinds of concerns and in their lives. And yeah, that's definitely a big one. One idea which I've heard pitched and which I've pitched is dealing kind of a little bit legislatively with some of the breakdown of Congress. And I'm curious what your thoughts on it are, is introducing legislation that, like, if a bill passes committee, it forces a vote in that chamber of Congress. If it passes that chamber of Congress, it triggers a vote in the opposite chamber of Congress. That seems like a no-brainer. Same thing with, like, nominations, things, same thing with resolutions. Does that seem like that would help?
No, absolutely. And I think that, again, it's going to require electing more people who don't want the tribalistic attitude.
Yeah.
Because, again, the parties are going to hold on to their privileges now, and they're going to avoid changing a lot of these rules because whoever gains power can manipulate the system to their own benefit. But there's a reason that Congress often has like a 7% approval rating.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm shocked when we get up to like 15%. I mean, Congress is a deeply troubled institution, in large part because it doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, it does not advance the interests of the American people anymore. And it used to. It used to work much more effectively. And some of those rules would help. And they're only made necessary because of all the other circumstances that have cropped up that push people into these little corners and make them want to play dirty like that. But because that's where we are, we absolutely should be imposing rules like that. The fact that something can just sit there forever and never get out. I mean, you do all the trouble of like convincing your committee to vote for something, and then, it just never happens. And I mean, my incumbent gets to brag, oh yes, I renamed a post office. Oh, I got a grant so that Caltrans could add an extra off ramp to this freeway. I mean, these are his great accomplishments. Like, really? I mean, come on. I mean, renaming a federal building is not an accomplishment, right?
No.
Actually solving serious problems faced by millions of people, that's worth doing. But we're not going to be able to get that legislation out. People are going to find ways to kill it.
Yeah, that's true. And that, again, gets back to your get to that tipping point.
Yeah. So again, I do want to give people a sense of hope, at least.
Yeah.
You know, like, yes, I keep saying this is a long-term fight. This is difficult. You know, there's a lot to do. But just look at the victories that we've gotten here. I mean, when Bernie announced that he was going to run, I was like, I ain't going to go anywhere. Like, no one's going to listen to that. It's like, I'd love it. You know, if he makes it, that's great. But because we often get people that will stand up and take principled positions and then they disappear very early on. You can't get the money. As far as I'm concerned, Bernie won 2016 because he did incredibly well against a deeply entrenched establishment candidate, winning tons of actual primaries all across the country, and changed the conversation nationally on big issues like Medicare.
Yes.
Right. That is a victory.
It is.
Every one of those is a victory. Every single squad member is a victory. Every single progressive candidate that steps up and actually gains traction is a victory for us that points the way forward. And if we can maintain a sense of hope, like, I mean, I know a lot of people that they just, their favorite candidate just drops out and like, oh, and they just give up. Like, well, it can't work. It doesn't matter. I'll just do this. I'll do that. We have to stay involved. and we have to push, and we have to get in those primaries and push good people.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit at a time, we right this ship.
I like that. I like that. Another question from chat here is, and this is one that I've thought about as well. Coronavirus has introduced some interesting dynamics to things, and one of those is some of the congressional meetings, at least in the House, have been remote, and that got my wife and I thinking, and she's the one that posed the question. It seems like there's a lot of benefit to allowing Congress people to work remotely from their district. They can stay in touch with their people. There's not really a reason why they need to be in DC all the time, even when it's time for voting. We have the technological infrastructure. So obviously it's not something that can just happen overnight, but you seem to think that's a decent idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, it was funny. There was a bill coming up, and like the Democrats wanted to pass something, and Ken made posts like, well, clearly they didn't think this important because X number of them didn't even bother to show up for the vote. And I was like, are you kidding? I mean, it's just such a shameless lie, because every single Democrat except for Tulsi Gabbard voted on it. All of them. A lot of them just voted remotely. Right. They didn't fly back in because, hello, harm reduction. Yeah. You're thinking in terms of a pandemic. There's a lot of ways in which we're learning some good lessons from this, and we should be able to take them forward and apply them. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why more people couldn't work remotely for part of the time anyway. We have people showing up at the office and doing busy work. I mean, there's been great studies about how people are productive at work for 2 or 3 hours, and then they spend time around the water cooler and browsing Facebook and, buying things on Amazon. And, like, they're not really doing much after a certain time. There's only so much you can do in the office. Mm-hmm. So if you freed people up more, and took them out of those situations where they could work more remotely, productivity would probably go up, as well as basic life and job satisfaction. And this certainly applies to Congress as well. My incumbent is a particularly horrifying example of that, in that he doesn't live in district. He's never here. I mean, he's got a place down by the beach.
Oh, geez.
He comes here when he has to meet with like the Chamber of Commerce to suck some money out of people, and that's about it. Other than that, he's in DC or he's out of district.
Wow.
There's no actual connection to ordinary people, which means you have no real incentive to give a damn. All you have to care about is those millionaires you can dial for bucks.
Yeah.
We need to change that incentive entirely and put people on the ground in their district so that they see the real concerns of people.
Yes. Fully agreed. So at this point, I do want to just hit you for kind of your expanding on some various issues that people in my chat are, concerned with. You have talked a fair bit about Medicare for All, so if you feel like you want to expand on that, that's fine, but I think, it's written pretty well.
I mean, yeah, up to you, and I'm going to guess a lot of your audience is more familiar with it, so the main thing I would talk about is just how I message it in my district anyway, because I tend to focus on a lot of issues very differently. Well, I can just give you just a short version of that kind of thing. Yeah. One of the key things I think we need to do is just reframe a lot of these policies and just start approaching them a little differently. I think we'd get a lot farther with people if we talked about things differently. So the Democrats talking about universal health care in moral terms, as our need to take care of people, that's not going to sway a lot of independents. Right. It's certainly not going to sway conservatives. Yeah. It's just bad psychology. The other side is moral too, but the morality is slightly different. And one of the things that people often have a tendency to fall into are these little, it's just tempting mental habits. Like, this makes sense to me, so of course I explain it logically to someone else. Of course it'll make sense. That's not necessarily the case. Mm-hmm. I mean, our basic conservative and liberal inclinations, right? The kind of forward-moving, cosmopolitan, let's experiment, find a new way to do things, versus this is the way Daddy did it, and this is a sense of stability. Those co-evolved, over a course of millions of years for a reason, because as a social species, they both serve a vital function in holding together the social unit. One is giving us the innovation. The other is holding the unit together and giving it a common identity and purpose. And if we think of the other side as something that has to be defeated and wiped out, as opposed to somebody that has to be engaged and swayed on an issue, it completely flips the script on that. And too many people, I think, when they get into these big issues, like, you don't understand, there's just something wrong with you. You're just dumb. And I'm tired of seeing people like, well, you're just stupid. Oh, you're just stupid. You're retarded. Like, and people hurl these horrible insults. I mean, I hear the R word all the time from, like, conservatives because they still seem to like that one for some reason. But the worst language comes out, and then all people do is they dig their heels in more, and you start defending an idea that honestly might be indefensible. It makes more sense to engage better with people and lay out breadcrumbs and let them find their own way. So I'll start talking slowly about these issues. And I talk about Medicare, for example, in terms of like a tax cut. And I talk about it in terms of freedom. And I think that one helps a lot with conservatives. If people did this across the country, we might already have Medicare. The key there is that, and my company does this too, they'll talk about it as like a government takeover of healthcare, and you can't do you can't have your insurance anymore. They want to take away your insurance. And like, no one gives a damn about their insurance. It's not the bean counters that you love. It's the physician.
Right.
It's the provider. It's the person that's actually taking care of you.
Yes.
And right now, all these different insurance companies have their own network. So, I mean, it might be like, hey, Derek, I got this great doctor. You'll love it. You should go see this person. And oh, I can't. Not a network. Can't do it. So basically, the markets have taken away that freedom from you. If we take away this middleman layer, we basically free up private providers, and we free them to compete with one another better, which actually makes it a good free market solution. Again, to put it into terms that will appeal to the rhetoric that conservatives are used to hearing. It basically allows for competition among different hospitals, clinics, doctors, whatever here, to compete for patients based upon who's better rather than who is the one you're stuck with in network. You see the issue there?
Which is a de facto monopoly. Yeah.
Medicare isn't taking away your doctor. It frees you up to see anyone you want.
Right.
And if you put it in terms of freedom and choice, you're using their language against them.
That's very clever. I like that.
I think we need to subvert Republican arguments more often and actually engage on their terms. We have too often on the left basically acceded to terms that they created. I mean, the whole abortion argument infuriates me on that issue. I mean, the fact that we even talk about it as abortion as an issue rather than bodily autonomy bothers me, because that makes a lot more sense, and it has broader applications as well. It would take care of issues like trans rights.
Right.
But basically, this split between pro-life and pro-choice is a trap, and a deliberate trap. If you say I'm pro-choice, and the other side says I'm pro-life, then all they're hearing is you are pro-death.
Right.
Because it's a choice to kill, because my side is for life.
Right.
And that's not it. That's not it. We know empirically that's not it. They're just pro-birth. It's not life, the issue, but it's the terminology matters. The rhetoric matters. So by giving into and using that terminology, you've already lost the argument, and it has allowed a generation to grow up thinking of Democrats as baby killers. And then you're stuck always responding to that basic question. Well, it's not baby, blah, blah, blah. It takes away from the actual argument. If instead we'd approached it in terms of bodily autonomy and made an argument for freedom, for you to own your own body and make your own choices, you're playing into the rhetoric that the right has been building up among their audience also for decades. And again, you win. So I like flipping the script on them wherever I can.
That's very good. That's very good. I'm curious, since we're talking issues, I'm curious of your script flip. This is an issue that I'm very passionate about, on immigration and how we get people to be able to migrate, cross an invisible line in the sand without it being a criminal act. Like, how do we get there from here?
And it's going to be a tricky one to unravel, because it plays on longer-term cultural nativism that's been built up, a sense of xenophobia. And that has realistically always been the case. One of the things that you can point to, at least as a historian, but this isn't convincing as a political argument for people, but it's useful, at least among Democrats, is to point out that, I mean, the right's been doing this for centuries, and they've always been wrong. Every single time they've been wrong. I mean, the Know Nothing movement was wrong. The Irish didn't destroy the country. I mean, it just, a bunch of Irish drunks and, Italian papists are going to take over the country and the Pope will be our president. And none of these things ever happen. I mean, the fears of East Asian migrants, they're yellow peril, all that crap. It's wrong every single time. but that
It's a
doesn't
hard
matter.
sell, yeah.
Humans don't think in terms of change over time, right? That's the historian's province. I mean, we don't really notice a lot of the changes that happen. I mean, I try to make points to people in classes, like things that you think are stable that you picked up from your parents are subtly different because of the circumstances that you're in. Things change over time, but it's difficult for us to recognize that change because it's very slow.
Right.
So what you have to do is get people thinking about it a bit differently. In the short run, the key is to address the core concern. What is the core concern for a lot of people, right? One half of that audience, the core concern is racism and nativism. You're not going to win them over. They don't care. Brown people, bad. Not going to reach that person. So discount them. Don't wade into that argument. Don't waste time. It's just a distraction. Focus on the people whose core concern, when you really boil it down and talk to them, is really economic. It's economic fears. It's worries that you're going to be out-competed for a job. It's worries that people are going to like drain money out of society, that they're like taking benefits or something. I mean, there's a lot of people who really do have those economic fears behind a lot of the stuff, and that primes them for a lot of the racist rhetoric.
Right.
But isn't their core motivation? We have to separate those two populations and target the one that you can sway on the economic issues. And realistically, migration has always ended up being a net benefit to every country that gains it. It leads to economic growth. It creates more jobs. And if you do it legally, people are paying in a lot more than they could possibly get back out of it.
Right.
So again, it's a net benefit. One of the arguments that you can, in this context, use from history, think about the generous social safety net created in Europe, right? Much better than ours, right? Right after World War II, let's create the National Health Service in Britain, blah, blah, blah. I mean, people started like creating an effective welfare state all across Northern and Western Europe and portions of Southern Europe after World War II, right? You know what paid for that? Migrant labor. Immigration. A lot of immigration from within Europe, from poorer and more war-torn parts, moved and settled in, and you had a massive boost in productivity in those areas because of the migration, and then migration continuing, because that's like immediately after World War II, and then in the decades after that because of decolonization. Tons of people from the late 50s on, all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, came from the former colonial territories, and they took those jobs. That is what made the European welfare state sustainable. Consistent growth because of immigration.
Right.
If you cut the immigration out, that's how the welfare state is unsustainable. So when people make the arguments, we can't afford this, we can't afford immigration because the welfare state is so expensive, they've got it completely backwards. Their nativism is what's making it harder to afford the welfare state. Every country that starts to make cuts in the number of people that they're allowing to move into the economy, those are places where the cost starts to go up per capita.
Right.
And the taxes start to bite more. You don't notice it when there's a lot more people working because they're producing so much extra value from their work. So you can kind of turn it back around on economics for people that are open to that. It's not going to work for the racists.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sure.
But it will work on a lot of people who have unconsciously absorbed some racist arguments but don't think of themselves that way and don't want to be racist.
Yeah. It pulls them back from the brink.
Concern and get them thinking about it's really their insecurity. They're afraid of losing their job. Yeah, and another one that helps there too. Honestly, just with the 1 second version there, it's one of the reasons I talk about basic income. Yeah, automation is the big threat to jobs. Automation is the big threat for a long time. Yeah, 47% of existing American jobs are at threat of being automated away in the next couple of decades. That's a lot of people that are going to lose their jobs. Yeah, and you can't stop that. I don't care how many walls you build up, how far you cut down the numbers of refugees, you're not going to stop that process. So shift their attention to that.
Very good. I like that. That's a very, very useful framing. And I'll be carrying that forward for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's useful to keep in mind. And again, it's one of the reasons that I actually was quite enthusiastic about Yang throwing his hat into the race. Yeah. Because he helped to mainstream an idea that realistically could have solved tons of problems before. I mean, how many people now, politicians, hell, my incumbent does this, exploit a lot of the racial tensions in this country. And a lot of this is spilling over because at the time that MLK was talking about a UBI in the 60s, the black-white wealth gap was about 4-1. Today it's 10-1. Right? Wealth has taken off for the white middle class, and it has left most black Americans behind, and that leaves people seething and angry. And it makes it a little harder to actually get things done right. I mean, it complicates everything. And again, instead of addressing the core issue, which is economic, which is leaving people behind, it allows people to play on the cultural issues and play on the racism. So it becomes a social and cultural issue. And next thing you know, Democrats and Republicans alike are both talking about race in their own ways here. But if we simply allow the populations to integrate and solve the economic issues, over time, the racial tensions fade away. This is one of the reasons that the country today is less racist than it was before. It is still racist, but it is far less so because we integrated more.
Right.
Because of people moving into cities and getting better jobs and settling in there. You grow up and like, oh, he's not so different from me. That's fine. And then the kids grow up playing together and they just don't care. It's one of the reasons cities are always more cosmopolitan and more liberal, because you see that diversity on a daily basis. So tackling that core issue first takes away a weapon that can be used against us. The whole race issue.
That does neatly slide into the next issue, of course. Systemic racism is definitely a problem. It manifests in economics, but it also manifests in our policing. And one of the main concerns across the nation right now, we're seeing protests constantly, is police who are completely unaccountable to the people they're supposed to serve. And those protesting are being met with those very same unaccountable police, basically trying to subjugate them. Obviously, we don't really have any sort of standardized how you do policing. We have very little federal laws, seemingly, about police. What kind of thoughts, what kind of direction do you think is even possible here that could be championed at the federal level?
Yeah, honestly, again, this is such a tough one because this is actually this has become such a big issue. And again, the right loves to run on cultural and social issues instead of actual policy, where they would more likely lose. It's actually the single biggest issue that Ken's running on is police. I will protect our police, Liam, and he makes up all kinds of crazy stuff. Like there's this completely made up quote where he says, I'm calling police terrorists or something.
Oh, jeez.
I was referring to like one particular action where people have been pressed up against a hill and tear gassed while they were unable to get away from it.
Yeah.
And I said, like, that kind of tactic is state terror.
It is.
State terror is not the same as calling police terrorists. It's completely nonsensical to do that, but you can see why he's able to twist that.
Yeah.
And why that would be like, oh, it would scare people, like, oh, Liam's scary. He wants to like take away your police. I'm like, that's not the issue at all. Again, the bigger problem here is that the circumstances mess things up. A lot of people get into policing for all the right reasons. They want to do something better, but the circumstances are problematic. I mean, you're generally not policing the community that you come from anymore. People are moved around into different areas, so they have no close roots there. A lot of the training is extremely short. We have the shortest police training of any rich country. So people are not equipped to handle the wide range of modern crises you run into. Then we have police showing up for all kinds of things that they're not remotely trained for or qualified for, like taking care of mental health issues.
Right.
Because they're the only agency that's been funded adequately. So the only person you can call, right? You 911, I've got an emergency here. The police are going to show up, and they don't always know how to respond. Right. Some of them will try hard. Others will just. They're humans, like anybody else. People will mess up in those circumstances. If we want to improve the situation, the key is to change the circumstances, not the whole demonization. And believe me, I totally get the frustrations that would drive people to do this. But what it does is it plays into an argument that the right is good at. And honestly, they're better at it. I mean, Nixon won on law and order. Reagan won on law and order.
Yeah.
Trump won on law and order. Yes, it has all kinds of like racial dog whistles attached to it. Yes, it has a problematic history. Yes, there's a whole authoritarian angle to it, but it works with the independents.
Yeah.
And we need enough of them or we don't win on any other issue. So the key is not to fall into the trap and to talk about things in a broader way that you can reach people on. So, I mean, for those bad apples, that come up, bad apple argument, right? Qualified immunity, right? That's a key one there, right? It can at least be done at the federal level. A much bigger issue, I think, and one that's more useful, is imposing a federal requirement for better training, including de-escalation training.
Mm-hmm.
If we say that to become a policeman requires 2 to 3 years of education and includes a heavy amount of de-escalation training, you're going to get a major benefit from that. Just police departments have used just like a few week-long training courses in de-escalation saw massive drops in police brutality. Massive drops, because you're equipping people to handle a foreign circumstance, something that they're not really sure how to do. So you're not like counting on like the individual's response. You're counting on training like kicking in.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, police all across this country, they have less than a year of training. It does not make sense to give people that much power with that little actual training. Cosmetologists, hairstylists require more training and certification than police officers do.
Wow.
That deeply frustrates me. It just doesn't make sense. But that, again, that's not the fault of individuals. That's the fault of the circumstances that we put them into. So there is a place where the federal government could intervene and say, we need basically a national standard for good training here. It requires X amount of time. It includes these things, and that would help a lot. And then funding other first responders, which police chiefs all across the country have said, like, we don't want to be in these situations. Yeah. Like the really regrettable one we just saw in Utah with the autistic kid.
Yeah.
They should never have been called for that.
No.
There should be another agency that gets called in that knows how to deal with those situations. You don't put like random Joe cop in those situations and then expect everyone to perform adequately. It's going to cause problems. But all of those problems, all they do is it feeds into the culture war and the back and forth that keeps us from getting anything done. If we want real solutions, we have to in some way like cut through the noise in a way.
Yeah.
And get to what is going to have a good long-term effect.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What do you think about like something like federally mandated body cams as well? Like, I'm surprised that there are states where that's still not happening.
Or them being able to turn them off.
Right. Or them.
Yeah. Realistically, I get why a lot of the police hate them too, because you feel constantly judged on things. The situation is bad enough that it kind of warrants it, Yeah. But if the circumstances were to improve, then maybe you wouldn't need that. In general, I tend to dislike, heavy amounts of like surveillance. I think we already live in a heavily surveilled society. And in the long run, I don't really like us falling into those traps. Mm-hmm. In this case, I do get it, though. I really get why it makes sense to do, because it often has been the only way to see what really happened in a situation when people are going to kind of like, circle the wagons and, defend, one of their buddies who might have done something wrong. The only way to find out is cams. So I would like to introduce things like that. If it gets pushed on a federal level, I'd like to do them with like it as part of a broader package of reforms.
Sure. Yeah.
And in setting that like, okay, so for 20 years, we're going to mandate body cams across the country while we completely change training and everything else and blah, blah, blah. And then we see how well it goes, because over time, if you see massive drops in abuse, then you can revisit that. If you don't, you maintain it and you have the option at least,
Yeah.
But I mean, on many issues, I do kind of default to a kind of like a more civil libertarian aspect here. And I do get that that just simply because they're public servants, it is providing a kind of transparency for us. And that also does make sense too. So you can make the argument for feeding into it and for continuing it long-term, for maintaining body cams. I can see a good rationale for it. The main reason that it troubles me is just the way it feeds into a trend that has nothing honestly to do with it. Just the increasing surveillance of every single part of our society. We're putting up cameras everywhere to watch everything. And it's always like, well, this will make us safer because we'll be able to see who was like breaking into your car in the parking lot. But it also lets them track you at all times. Yeah. And the more cameras you put around there, you've got tons of now mobile cameras that get caught into like AI systems I don't want Skynet, I mean, there is a potential for a seriously dystopian future connected to what actually on its surface is a really good idea that protects people.
That's fair.
I'm worried about unintended consequences.
There's another idea that we've batted around in my chat in the past, that I'm curious of your thoughts on. And obviously with all of these ideas, you're free to disagree. We're pretty open-minded. We disagree in chat quite a bit. But this notion of if a police officer, even if he has not committed a crime, loses the confidence in the community that he is serving, in my mind, having some sort of mechanism where the community can say, we don't want to be policed by this individual, whether that's just too many grievances raised or what have you. If you are in charge of enforcing law and order and peace and using force to do so, because that's ultimately what policing is, it makes sense that you would require the consent and trust of the community that you're patrolling. So having some mechanism for people to be able to challenge an officer who is acting out and have some mechanism themselves to be overseers seems like it would be a useful mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the key to that one, well, first off, for me, in the long run, I want us to get back to community policing.
Hey, there you go.
On from the community, so they know the people. They know, oh yeah, like Fred is such and such. He has this issue. You have at least some understanding of what your neighborhood is like and what needs to get done, and people can trust you because, oh yeah, Billy grew up here. They know who he is, right? And in the long run, you can also, in moving in that direction, democratize it in a sense. In the same way that sheriffs are often elected. That was a good old tradition.
Yeah,
but
very much.
We're only electing the head now of an entire county police department and not all the individual officers.
Right.
You should have to have the trust of the community. So if the community votes you out, they should be able to vote you out. But we have a serious hurdle to overcome here. And that, again, it has to do with how you can best combat right-wing rhetoric. Because they have kind of conditioned people to think of the police as they're currently constituted, as their saviors, and nothing that possibly touches them can be considered. And it's difficult to talk about a reform that's significant because that would mean some cops would lose their jobs.
Yeah. And
that plays into the whole defund and abolish kind of rhetoric there and allows them to run against you. I think one thing that we can do, if you're going to win these arguments, and again, this is one that would take a long time to do.
Yeah.
But I think this is a winnable argument, honestly, and it's one that you can beat the right on, but you have to use the founders' logic. Okay. You have to point back to, this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we want to limit power over the individual. Individualism is something that conservatives feel that they have stolen, that it's theirs, that it's we are the ones who stand for individual rights and free, and they're not. I mean, that's literally what liberalism was. I mean, liberalism as an idea is limited government and, keeping the government out of your face. But conservatives feel that they have taken on that mantle.
Yeah.
And if you can, again, call them on that, it forces them to look in the mirror and recognize that the argument they're making is actually just an authoritarian one. I mean, it's ultimately no different from anybody defending any other kind of Gestapo tactics and any other more of a police state sort of environment. There's always, oh yeah, of course. Well, if you didn't do anything wrong, you have nothing to fear. That is an authoritarian argument. It's not a freedom-based argument.
Correct.
Conservatives want to feel that they are heirs to the Constitution and to American freedoms. Call them on that and say the founders did not create these kind of systems for a reason. In fact, you can even play into the whole Second Amendment question, because why did we have that in the first place? Because we didn't have police.
Right.
There was no standing army and no police. So you had to have people able to come together into a local militia when there's a crazy person running through town shooting people. You call together a posse and you chase him down. Right? So if we want that freedom, okay, then it comes with a certain responsibility. And that applies to policing as well. What we've done is we've taken the responsibility out of it. We've created an unaccountable bureaucratic entity, given it a monopoly of force and the ability to do whatever it wants, and then said you cannot criticize it at all without being somehow unpatriotic. That's as un-American as it gets at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And if you can whittle away at them by focusing on the freedom aspect of it, right, then I think that could be a long-term strategy. But it's a difficult one because the cult around that is so strong. And ultimately, the reason for conservatives to love it in the first place is the reflexive authoritarianism in conservative thinking.
Right.
I mean, you're really getting at that, but the language they use isn't. They honestly feel that their position is the one that supports greater freedom. The founders disagree. So if somebody who's like playing uber patriot, right, deploy the founders to make your case.
That's a good way of angling it. All right, so another topic is, of course, climate change. And when I was reading through your page on it, one of the analogies that I really liked on it was you're looking at Venus. So I wonder if you could explain that to chat.
Well, it's intentionally hyperbolic, but realistically, one of the reasons that you can melt lead on the surface of Venus is a runaway greenhouse effect. It's too much CO2 in the atmosphere. It could reach a point where life is unsustainable, or at least many forms of life, life that we recognize. We are already in the midst of a massive extinction event. I mean, the amount of we've cut, what is it, something like 2/3 of biodiversity just since the 1970s. I mean, the extinction rate is phenomenal already, and it's already forcing massive changes in habitats. Animals are having to move to higher or lower ground or whatever, trying to get away from changes in their environment, in their environments, and that is also going to disrupt other ecosystems and lead to even more death. The key really for us is just to recognize what the carbon cycle really is. Yes, there are natural rhythms in the world, and I hate when conservatives are like, well, it's gotten this hot before in the past. I'm like, yes, massive volcanic eruptions that killed most of life on Earth. Congratulations. Is that something that we want? No. it just, you call them on the passivity of it. Oh, okay, so we should just rell over and let the Earth kill us? No, you would still fight back even if it was a natural event.
Right.
And we can do things like this if we actually, a great one I think too, in terms of metaphorical framing for it. I don't know. Point back to the innovation around the space race, right? I mean, competition with Soviets. They got to space first. We should do this here. Ultimately, that's what gave us these things. I mean, because we invested so much in the tech to do that it had tons of ripple effects that completely changed our lives.
Yeah.
The same thing would come out of investment in green technologies. And we could actually get to where we could extract that carbon from the atmosphere. If we can master carbon capture stuff initially at the source and then find ways to actually pull the stuff out of the atmosphere and collect it, in the long run, you're honestly laying some of the foundations for colonizing Venus too, although that's a much longer term process. But you're developing technologies that would have other effects, other uses to it. But if we allow it to get hotter and hotter here, and it will get hotter because there's more carbon in the atmosphere, so when the heat comes in from the sun, it can't bounce back out. What is it? It's basically like a thicker atmosphere. It's like a thick haze, right? Thicker atmospheres do protect the surface in some ways and damage it in others. In this case, the heat comes in and can't get back out, so we basically fry. And we're going to get to a point where we're already looking at it. If we get to the point where we have a 3 degrees Celsius rise, not like the 2 they're already expecting now. If we keep going, and we're not cutting our emissions, they're still going up.
Yeah.
But if we get to a 3 Celsius increase in temperatures, we're going to have heat waves in large parts of the United States that will kill mammal life that's outdoors. There'll be a heat wave that hits the southeast, and literally every animal that's not in the shade is going to drop dead from a heat stroke. Because beyond a certain temperature, our brains shut down.
Yeah.
It literally just kills you.
Yeah.
And why do you want to live in a situation where that's a possibility, where we have to hide in our air-conditioned houses and can't go outdoors anymore? Why not innovate and develop the technologies that can save us?
Policy-wise, how do we get there from here?
Well, one of the key ways to do that is to and this is where, again, I think there's something genius in talking about the Green New Deal as a kind of New Deal, because it does emphasize the economic aspect of it. But honestly, I think Democrats have failed to articulate that well enough. And partly that's because there's so few people talking about it, and so much the establishment pushed back against it. it really does involve a reorienting of the economy itself and investment in people and technologies, right? That's the important part of the Green New Deal. It's not like, let's, I don't know, ban cow farts or some stupid thing, whatever that, I mean, I don't know, Calvert's telling people like, oh, Liam wants to take away your hamburgers. I'm like, I'm not even talking about that. What I'm talking about is something equivalent to the space race. Let's dump money into the American economy. It'll put people back to work. It'll solve our current unemployment issues here. It'll create tons of good paying jobs, and we will build up a much better infrastructure, which in the long run gives us cleaner air, cleaner water. Everything ends up being better off. But as long as you think of it in terms of the environment, you're not going to win over the conservatives.
It also presumably,
a lot of conservatives like, we need to preserve the world for your great grandkids, or for like, the air quality in other places. I don't care. Like, this seems fine. Just, that meme with like the fire in the room, like, this is fine. You don't notice it. It just creeps up on you a little bit of time. Or like, I love that the frog in the water pot idea. You slowly raise the temperature and they don't notice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, until it's too late.
Pretty much what we're dealing with here. Mm-hmm. So what you have to do is get them thinking about it. And honestly, you can subvert some of the right-wing rhetoric there again. You know how many people are talking about like competition with China and this and that, right? There's this whole like economic nationalist argument that comes out on the right today. Like, cool. You know that China's kicking our ass in battery and solar technology, right? We were the world leader in solar cells and batteries. And now China is literally kicking our ass in it. Why? Because we stopped investing. You want America to be on top, buddy? Cool. Support the Green New Deal, because I want to invest in American businesses and American ingenuity so we can get ahead. The big airy abstraction about saving the planet isn't going to win enough people to do well electorally. It's just not. Human beings, and this is just nice framing technique. We are capable of reason and abstraction, but it's not our natural mode. We're much more apt to respond in terms of like emotion and instinct.
Right.
A lot of us are capable of complex reasoned thought, but that's not how you're going to like motivate people in a democracy. You have to find a different hook, and getting people to think, my kid's going to get a great full-time job with great benefits that's going to set him up. That'll work. And in the process, we save the planet.
That's a good framing. That is a good framing. The Chinese framing it as kind of competition with them is actually especially poignant. I was just reading an article where they made a commitment to approach carbon neutrality by like 2060. Like they're planning a major investment in that direction, and
which is amazing given how many coal plants they've brought up because they wanted to develop so fast, and they have been developing very fast. But granted, they still have 4 times our population for an economy the same size, so still a lot higher levels of poverty. But yeah, the fact that they're willing to invest that heavily in solar and wind technologies, they're going to dominate these industries. It's another one too. You can play at a lot. Again, on the right, people are like, well, we've lost all these good manufacturing jobs, this and that. And the scapegoating is like, blame trade. If we just cut off trade, then American jobs would come back. And like, okay, so you just want us to do crappy work or whatever, not really compete? I mean, the Germans have a 3% unemployment rate and a massive trade surplus, because when they're losing out in certain sectors, they retrain people in other good areas, and they continue to kick ass. So they're selling like wind and sea turbines all over for these green technology projects all around the world.
Right.
They're a major technology exporter still. We export less than Germany does.
Wow.
And this frustrates me for a country. We are 7 times the size of Germany's economy. Well, closer to 6, but like at least 6 times the size of Germany's economy. Right. And 5 times the population? 4.5, 5 times? Like that. Yeah, it's like 80 some million to 320. Yeah, whatever. Maths aren't my thing. But huge difference there too. And yet, in real terms, not per capita, in real terms, they export more than we do. That's a choice. We chose to develop that kind of economy and not to innovate anymore. And that's why we're losing out to these other countries. And when we just let people scapegoat the other countries, we're ignoring the real issue again. Mm-hmm. And you can exploit that fear of like, their fear of like, competition with other countries and bring it over to your side by saying, why don't we just invest in Americans again? Yeah. Why don't we just invest in the American worker and in American industries? Oh, okay. So for things like, environmentalism, I really like to keep the focus on the New Deal aspect of the Green New Deal. And I think if we did that more, it wouldn't be this crazy radical idea that's so easily dismissed and lampooned.
Right. I like that. I like that. And it also plays into the independence from foreign, like oil and natural gas exporters too.
Energy independence, yeah, which the right loves. They think that we need to like crank out tons more oil and gas to do it. We can achieve energy independence without touching that crap at all.
Yeah,
we don't need it. I mean, as it is, we export the extra. I mean, we don't need it as it is. We tend, well, of course, we tend to export our lower quality crude and then import the sweet crude that we want. But you know, we haven't really achieved energy independence, and I hate that we, as Democrats don't engage enough on the economy as a whole. But like this is another area where like the right kicks their ass because they say, well, look, we achieved energy independence, and Democrats are not saying, no, you didn't. We haven't. We still import tons of oil and gas, and we're still dependent on that. We're just exporting like the crappiest crude that we get out of like the shale deposits and whatnot.
Right.
The fact that we're an oil exporter does not mean we're energy independent. If we made good use of like the winds on the Great Plains and the sun in the southwest here, and we built a good renewable infrastructure and a smart grid and the high capacity transmission lines to move the stuff all across the country, we can achieve complete energy independence. Depending on nothing but like, it's sunny some days, it's windy some days, and you're just storing the stuff in good batteries and moving it around where you need to. You're no longer dependent on any resource. As long as we stay where we are, we're going to end up in tons of resource wars across the 21st century. We're going to be like, going to war over oil and gas. Why?
Yeah.
It's freaking 19th century technologies. Why aren't we thinking of like 21st century technologies? I like telling Republicans and conservatives, why don't we get back to an innovative America?
Yeah.
Right? An America that's like on top of the world and that everyone is like looking at like, wow, America has the highest quality of living. We don't anymore. Our living standards are steadily falling. We're 17th in the world in quality of life now. Yeah. And we are really low in tons of other areas.
Yeah, we're falling on the democracy index.
36th, health, we're 35th. Social mobility. Right? People used to come to the United States because, my ancestors all came here because they were dirt poor. They were dirt poor farmers from like Ireland, Sicily, and Poland. They all came here with nothing. And like they wanted to work hard and get ahead because we were a less class-based society, and you could do that here. That's no longer true. We're 27th in the world for social mobility. That should offend conservatives because, again, greatest country on earth. Like, really? Well, let's make it that, I don't know, flip it around on them. Like, okay, let's make America great again. Let's actually invest in America again. Really? Make America great again was a gift that we could have exploited to actually get people talking about the policies that made us rich in the first place. And that again gets back to your progressive tax rate. Unless you're pointing back to the 50s because you're a racist and you want to be publicly racist again, which granted, there are some people in his coalition. A lot of people loved that because back in the 50s, you could have one person working, a stay-at-home spouse, support 3 kids in a house, a 2-car garage, and a modern kitchen and everything there, and you'd be fine. Like, and it allowed people to with manufacturing jobs move out into the suburbs and have that American dream, right? That's what a lot of them were thinking about. We can get there.
Yes.
But it involves taxing the hell out of the rich to change the incentives. And we're not willing to have those economic arguments. I think we need to flip the script on them and say, look, you want that? This is how you get it. And again, there's a lot of economic illiteracy on the left that frankly does us a disservice, because taxing the rich is not about getting the cash to invest in something. They can beat that mathematically. They can say, well, if you take all the wealth from all the billionaires, it still runs out. It doesn't matter. It's about long-term incentives. It's about setting things up so that it works year after year after year. And it's a little bit more abstract, but you can make the argument. You can show people how it works, especially since it did work then and it still works well all around the world. We're going in the wrong direction here.
Yes, we are.
It gets back to why I got in politics in the first place. It's just frustrating as hell to me that, for my entire life, this country's been in decline. And I think we can do better.
So it looks like we're approaching, well, we're pretty much at end of time, but I want to thank you very, very much for being willing to meet with us. I'm going to be, of course, cutting this, putting it out onto YouTube and such, because you have a lot of very valuable stuff to say. Obviously, if anyone is able to donate to Liam, by all means do so. Your website, I've plugged it before, I'll plug it again over here. But yeah, $5 a month can save democracy. So
exactly. I mean, we're in the last month of this cycle here, and yeah, it's a tough district, but it's absolutely flippable. If we can keep making those calls, keep getting more postcards in people's hands, like keep texting people, and if we get high turnout, we can flip it this time. But this is a long-term fight all across the country, and we're going to stay at this. And if we can change this, the kinds of arguments made, and keep pushing forward here, we're making a long-term investment in saving our democracy here. So yeah, I mean, liamomera.org, the most generically Irish name ever. So Liam O'Mara. But liamomera.org has got the little volunteer and donate links up on the very top there. I'm also super active all over social media, so people can interact with me there and follow kinds of things I'm always posting. We've got events all the time too. We're actually doing a fun one this weekend. Is a little a debate with our incumbent, but it's gonna be like this evil puppet standing in for him.
It's still
gonna be great.
Very, very good. I do want to ask one last thing before you go, because one of the things you championed was we have to push past that threshold. So, what would your elevator pitch be to someone who was considering getting into politics? How would you even start? What's the first step?
Maybe people to get involved in like actually doing this, like running.
Actually running, yes.
First thing is just do it. Like, I mean, your city council matters. Your county board of supervisors matters. Your water board matters. Everything does. State houses matter. Everything does. And the more of us check out, the more you allow extremists to take power. And I mean, as it was, like, Democrats used to have 3/4 of the state houses in the country, and today we've got about 1/3. I mean, we've been falling steadily there in terms of our control because more people have checked out.
Right.
And one of the key issues there is that it's so driven by money that a lot of people just don't care about the candidates that they get. Well, we can beat that by putting good candidates in the primaries in the first place. And then if we support those good candidates in our primaries and we get them across that threshold, then we actually have somebody worth voting for every November. And that makes a huge difference. It is daunting because there's so much to learn. One of the things that we intend to do is contribute a lot back. Like there's going to be notebooks produced for how to do tons of things that we're going to contribute here to like the county so that people are able to run and get involved in things. I'm supporting tons of like, local candidates as well, and we'll continue to do that. Mm-hmm. There are people you can get involved in. Local clubs for your party are a good start there. Okay. Local activist groups are a good start there. And there's tons of like good books and whatnot. If anyone's interested, there's resources I could give you, but everybody getting involved, it matters. If we give people a good choice, every single cycle, a few more of those good people get through. Very, very good.
Well, I've appreciated this. It's been illuminating, and I've struggled to maintain an optimism message in these times, so you've given a lot to be hopeful about, frankly. So you have my gratitude for that. And chat has been very appreciative of you as well, being willing to take the time and meet with us. Best luck in your race. Really hope that you're able to get there. And if not, really hoping to see you on the campaign trail again next election cycle. So,
yeah, sounds good. We're not going anywhere.
Good. Thanks so much. So, thank you, Liam.
Have a good one.
You as well.